Have you ever wondered, how does the book of Genesis really all fit together? I mean, it's got some of our favorite stories and our favorite characters, everyone from Adam and Eve to Noah, Abraham, Joseph. They're all great, but how does this actually work together? How in the world can you have a book that, on one hand, is just so cosmic, like the creation of the universe, or like this huge flood or Tower of Babel, and then suddenly it's like, oh, yeah, Abraham is moving from, Kansas to Oklahoma. Like, it's like, okay, all right, joke. He didn't move from Kansas to Oklahoma.
Yeah.
That happened. But it's kind of interesting. Like, we have these family dramas in the later part of the book. How does this all fit together? Well, I'm talking to Dr. Nathan French, and he has a PhD in Hebrew Bible and ancient Near Eastern studies. He's super smart. Let's ask him and let's get his take. Can you help us understand the book of Genesis? How does this first part, Genesis 1 through 11, with creation, flood, Tower of Babel, etc., how does it fit with what seem like these family dramas of, Abraham and his descendants trying to get along together? How does this all
Yeah.
fit together?
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, it's good. Such a great question. Thank you for asking, Monty, and having me on again. So I think the best way to really, well, when I teach Genesis, I often have to tell students, look, you have Genesis 1 through 11. We have the whole creation narrative. We call it something like prehistory. That's what I like to call it, right? So it's the prehistorical narratives that we have. That is, before we get to sort of modern history, the time of Abraham, we got to tell about what happened in the most ancient past. And that's really Genesis 1 through 11 with some of your core themes of creation, of creation of everything, including that is humans. What is their vocation? What are they to be doing? Why has God created them? What is their purpose? Why do humans get married with one man, one woman? Why do they have a family? Why does progeny come forth from that? And then, of course, sin, which we often talk about. The first rebellion is what I like to say, and how that leads into the first murder that takes place in Genesis 4. And from there, we have this good creation that God has created and the undoing of that creation in Genesis 6, where the waters come up from above and they come down from below, and you have just a full on collapsing of the creation that God has created. But he saves humanity, right? He saves humanity through the judgment, and new creation comes forth at the end of that story, followed by another rebellion that happens again in Genesis 11. And then we just get to 12 all of a sudden, where Abraham shows up. And the rest of the book is about Abraham and his descendants, right? So you have 12 to 50, a whole lot of chapters that are dedicated to the story of Abraham himself and his entire family, all the way to Genesis 50 with Joseph in Egypt. And so the question is, what are we really doing with Genesis 1 through 11? Because it really seems the whole point is Genesis 12 to 50, but they really are connected. The whole point of Genesis 1 through 11 is to get us to Genesis 12. I think that that is the main point that we want to make here. And the rabbis have said it before, and others have made the point that I think it goes something like this, that the Lord allowed everything to happen the way that it did with Adam, with Adam, the first man, because he knew that Abraham would come someday and bring righteousness in the earth, right? So Abraham is sort of contrasted with Adam as a second Adam. And God's going to work with Abraham in order to bring about the very creation that he had intended all along. And it is going to be through his family that's going to happen. But I want to step back just one bit before I come back to Abraham here and the family of Abraham. And that is that in Genesis 3, Genesis 2 and 3, we have the creation of the first humans, the man and the woman, and the command that is given to them, even at the end of Genesis 1, but then honing in onto the Eden narrative, the command is to be fruitful and to multiply. That is, that they are to have a big family on the earth. But in Genesis 2 to 3, there is a test, and the test is going to be centered around two trees. And this is the theme, I think, that's going to carry through Genesis. One, the procreation theme, that is progeny, family, and the line of humans continuing. But this right here, I think, is the key in Genesis 2 to 3, and it comes from verse 9, where we have two trees in the garden. Of course, I've written a big book on one of these trees, the
You
tree of
have.
the knowledge of good and evil. But these two trees are actually, I think, central to the whole of the book of Genesis, believe it or not. So Genesis 2:9, Ve'etz chaim b'toch hagan ve'etz da'at tova ra. The tree of life was in the midst of the garden, and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, or as I translate, the tree of the knowledge of knowing good and evil. Interestingly, for the rest of Genesis 2 and 3, the tree of life doesn't appear again until 3:22. However, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil seems to be all over the place. It is mentioned 2:17. It's the command not to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. You have it again in 3:5, where the serpent says, the Lord just doesn't want you to eat from it because he knows that when you do, you'll become like him and the divine beings, and you'll be knowers of good and evil, right? And then you have emphasis in Genesis, what, 9 and 11, I believe again, where the Lord says, did you eat from the tree I told you not to eat from which I told you not to eat? You have the curses that come forth. And then it's mentioned again in 3:22, behold, the man has become like one of us, leda'ato vera, or the humans have become like one of us, knowing good and evil, lest he stretch out his hand, take from the tree of life, eat and live forever, dot, dot, dot. In Hebrew, it just goes on from there. And the next thing you know, the Lord's pushing them out of the garden. He puts a cherub, the cherubim right in front of the garden with the flaming swords to keep the humans from eating from the tree of life, because it seems that theme so prominent in the ancient Near East. How is it that humans can have divine wisdom and knowledge but not have divine bodily life? Why is it that humans can be wise as the gods but be forbidden to live forever like the gods? That is the theme of Genesis 2 to 3. How is it that humans can have divine knowledge that was the Lord's knowledge all along, but be forbidden to have divine life like the Lord himself? Well, it seems, I think, that as Father, he has created his Son, but his Son is now in rebellion. The test of real wisdom was not to take divine wisdom, but to actually obey the wisdom in the narrative, which was the command of Genesis 2:17, not to eat from the tree. And had the humans been able to eat from had they obeyed the command, they would have then been able to eat from the tree. They would have received divine knowledge. They would have then eaten from the tree of life. They would have received divine life. But that's not the story. The story is humans have divine wisdom, but they've taken it in rebellion to the Lord, seeming to have followed a Nahash, which might be a rogue divine being if we consider other narratives in the rest of the Hebrew Bible. So they are in that divine human rebellion against the Lord, and the Lord has removed them from the garden in an exodus to keep them from living forever so that he can redeem them. How is he going to do it? He's going to do it with Abraham. When Abraham comes forth, the promise that comes to Abraham is, through you, I'm going to bless all the nations of the earth. And it's really interesting because when you finally get to the fact that Abraham and Sarah in their old age still don't have the son to be born, it is clear here that the Lord shows up and it is a miraculous birth. So, in a sense, the Lord is involved in the issue of that particular marriage of Abraham and Sarah, and Yitzhak comes forth. And we all laugh with Yitzhak as he comes forth, rejoicing that he has come forth as the promised child, and God is involved in it. There is a sense of real divine sonship. So if we go back to Genesis 3, it's clear. I'm going to destroy the serpent with the seed of the woman. And so there is a contrast between the issue of the serpent and the issue of God himself. And that divine sonship carries all the way, I think, through to Joseph, who ends up in Egypt wearing his cloak as the firstborn son of Jacob, a right that had not been given to him in being the firstborn, but a right that had been placed upon him by his father. And it shows all that tension that's happening there in the family with sin and retribution, which I actually claim is that retribution stuff very close to the tree of the knowledge of good and evil itself. So, all that to say, it's a story of how it is that the blessing promised to come to all nations through Abraham is going to come through his issue and through his line as a way of redeeming all of humanity and sorting out the mess of Genesis 1 through 11, especially that final rebellion that happens in chapter 11 with the Tower of Babel and the humans trying to thwart the plans of the Lord by worshiping false gods and serving them.
So good. So much gold here. If you'd like a different question for Dr. French to respond to, go ahead in the comment section below. We'd love to hear what are your questions, and maybe we'll take one of those for a future video like this. We're experimenting with shorter content, around 10 minutes, to just dive straight into interesting questions with deep answers. Also, if you would love to ask a question to Dr. French or myself and actually be able to go back and forth and dialogue on these things, consider joining our Hebrew Bible Insights cohort. On Patreon, we have a number of ways for any of you who feel like you want to support our mission of making sense of the Old Testament for the church. And we try to give some benefits for that as well. And one of those for the cohort tier is once a month, we actually get together on a small group Zoom session where we can see each other, talk, discuss things. And our people in our cohort, they often have really interesting questions that they ask. And it's really fun. We really enjoy it. And maybe one of you that's watching this would love to join that. Links in the show notes below. Thank you, Dr. French, for your wisdom
Yeah.
and sharing
Thanks for having
insights
me.
on the book of Genesis. It's such an important book, right? To get this foundational book is really important for understanding the rest of the story of Scripture. We don't want to run into a roadblock where we already don't understand Abraham, instead of realizing, man, Abraham is absolutely central to the plot development of this story. So thank you very much. Great insights. Looking forward to seeing you all in the next video.